Vanakkam. Hello, friends. In exploring the continuing worship of the primeval god Shiva from ancient times, starting with the Harappan Valley, where in Dholavira in Gujarat, 4 feet high bulbous columns were excavated along with ringstones in the 1960s, a mark of the Linga motif itself, and the Proto Shiva, the continuation from an iconic to an anthropomorphic deity. In the last episode, we saw how the seals of the Indus, which carried the imagery of Proto Shiva, could have been a name of a god, a person named after the god, as is a continuing tradition today in this part of the country. In his very intriguing and interesting paper, How Did the Great God Get a Blue Neck? Airavadam Mahadevan explores one of the oft recurring pair symbols in the Indus seals, one which looks like a trident accompanied by a horn deity as Neelakandan. How does he arrive at this Tamil name? A very interesting hypothesis indeed, wherein the trident symbol is read as great by associating it with a parallel Sumerian ideogram. Great in Tamil is Nedu as in Nedumal, Neduvel. Another ideology is Neel, Neel Malai, Neel Nidhi for great wealth, a term used in Jeevaka Sindhamani. The Pingala Nihandu, the Tamil dictionary, gives the name Neel the meaning great. Then comes the second word, the correlate to the horn deity. For this, he goes to the Dravidian etymological dictionary, published in the year 1961 by two eminent scholars, Burrow and Emino. This is a notable work that combines the four major Dravidian languages together with a few regional languages like Tulu and gives the meaning and the roots of an entire corpus of words in English. The two noted personalities, Thomas Burrow, an Indologist and a professor of Sanskrit from the University of Oxford, and Murray Barnson Emiru, an emeritus professor and founder of the Department of Linguistics in the University of California, Berkeley, are to be noted here as this dictionary is used by research scholars till date. Here, the horn deity, the warrior god, is related to the word Kandu, which means a warrior, from Kada, Kadai, Kidai, which means a ram and a bull, and the association of Kadama, a bison, Kandi, a buffalo, and from here the warrior god or warrior is related to references in Sangam literature like Tintiral Kandan, Kandaradittan, the great Chola king. Ular Sila Kandarhal is a usage in Periyapuranam, which means here are some warriors. So, Neel plus Kandan, Neela Kandu or Neela Kandan, and Airavadam Mahadevan is of the opinion that this loan word was borrowed into Sanskrit without changing the phonetics, but gets a new meaning in Sanskrit. How? Neela becomes related to the color blue and Kand to the throat, and hence the blue-throated one, and from there with this meaning it comes back into Tamil, by which time a Puranic story, the churning of the ocean, the Alagala poison which Shiva swallows and hence gets a blue throat, is correlated to it. And in the ancient Sangam literary works, again the Sangam literature period from 3rd century BC to 3rd century AD, the Purananuru calls this ancient lord as Neela Manimidatru Oruvan, where Midaru means the neck, and Manimidatran also calls him Mukkat Selvar, the one with the 3 eyes, the right and left eye meaning the sun and the moon. The third eye, which is Netrikan, is the inner eye when opened, resolves or absolves us of our ignorance. So, such associations are traced to the Sangam literary works where the name Shiva itself doesn't find a mention, but the Lord and his attributes are denoted in very many terms, And Neelameni Val Ilai Pahathu Oruvan is how he is described in the Kadavul Vazhthu of Ainguru Nooru, by which time the association of Umayuru Pahan or Ammayappar, the Ardhanarishwara, the yin and the yang, the male and female equilibrium is brought about in imagery and hence has been worshipped by our ancestors for over 2000 years. A line in Madurai Kanji goes on to describe the Lord as Tol Mudu Kadavul Pinnar Meya. Here, Tol means ancient, very old, Tolaivu, in a distant past. Again, Mudu, very, very old. So, the double epithet of Tol Mudu indicates that this Lord was worshipped by the Tamil people from very ancient times. From the Indus Valley, we know that with the decline of the civilization, the people migrated to the south and east and carried their religion and culture with them. But there seems to be a gap of 1,000 years, during which time epigraphical, archaeological evidences are very hard to come by, and especially in the Tamil context, except for a few ones here and there such as the anthropomorphic axe, the Maruvar Nediyon dated to 800 and 500 BCE, or the broken urn burial potteries of Adichanallur, the Celt stone discovered in Sembian Kandiur near Mayavaram, that Airavada Mahadevan dated to 1500 BCE and established that indeed it did carry Indus letters. The attestation from archaeology to the references in Tamil Sangam literature are very far and few to come by. Well, we do know that this great prehistoric god had a pan-India presence and was also worshipped in his Swayambhu form, Swayambhu, which is described by the Tamil term Tan Thondri, as you would see here in Arunachal Pradesh in the famous imagery of a 20-foot high Linga temple at the Kado Hills and the massive Linga within the Kavala caves in Dandeli in North Karnataka, the 12 feet high colossal Sivalinga at Baramulla, Kashmir, the picture taken in the year 1910. What is noticeable is that in all these lingas, the linga itself is freestanding as a pillar with no support at the bottom. One of the earliest Ekamukha lingas at Udayagiri shows a circular groove cut into the base. Similar one can be seen here in the Shivalinga of Ba Caves, Madhya Pradesh. Researchers opine that this groove could simply be a provision to drain the excess water while performing ablution of the Lord. Now, in due course of time, this becomes the Avudai with its yoni associations and its own spiritual symbolism. We saw in the previous episode how the Ekamukha Linga was associated with sepulchral shrines, the Pallipadai Koilhal, the Kinnimangalam inscription dated to 2nd century BC. From this point, the absence of other archaeological evidences, one has to look at the north, where during this Sangam period, there flourished the empires of the Mauryas, the Guptas, the Sanga dynasty. The Mauryan dynasty, which ruled in the northern part of India from 322 to 185 BCE, have left behind a legacy of rock sculptures and stone art, where the Greek and Hellenistic influences can be seen, as in this spectacular entry arc of the Loma Rishi caves in Barabar. The two monumental yakshas discovered in Patna, 2 meters tall, dated to the 3rd century BCE. Below these yakshas are the inscription of their names in Brahmi script, Yaki Achyuta Satigika and Yaki Sanadanananda. And here the lettering begins with Ya, which is clearly a Tamil letter. The Mauryan Empire, which had both Hinduism and Buddhism coexisting, with Buddhism gaining its peak during the rule of Emperor Ashoka, eventually dissolved in the year 185 BCE with the foundation of the Sanga dynasty, founded by Pushyamitra Sanga with Padaliputra at its capital. These emperors were Hindus and brought back the Hindu fold with great flourishing art and architecture, and the Madura school of art evolved during their rule. The noted Yoga Sutra composer Patanjali lived during this period and composed the Mahabhashyam on Panini's Sanskrit grammar, the great commentary. Here is a 2nd century BCE Sunga Yaksha, which is now in a French museum made out of terracotta, their excellence in artistry. And here is the Madura art style, Lagulisha. Lagulisha, a sect of Saivism, where the Lord is found in his ithyphallic state, denoting that he is an ascetic. And rather than erotic imagery, the ithyphallic aspect denotes asceticism and conserved procreative potentialities, as with our Pichadanar, Vairagya or self-control, Suyakattupadu, which was rated very high by the ancients. During the same time, towards the end of the Sanga dynasty, the Kushanas, who were a Bactrian dynasty ruling from Afghanistan, the greatest of their king Kanishka made incursions into the Indian subcontinent up to Varanasi, and though they were Buddhists themselves, and the Kanishka's time was when Buddhism reached out through Afghanistan to China, he also encouraged Hinduism, as is denoted by this coin. This golden coin dated to 195 CE, where on one side you have the image of the emperor and on the other side an imagery of Lord Shiva shown with a trident and a bull. Here is another coin issued by King Vasudeva, a successor of Huvishka, who came after Kanishka, and here too on the one side you see the imagery of the king, again the imagery of a three-faced Shiva with a bull and trident with an inscription below that reads Oisho. The next major Hindu empire that came in North India around the 3rd century AD was the Gupta Empire. The dynasty of the Guptas, who ruled over a vast territory and contributed to art and architecture, is considered as the golden age of India by many historians. This is a Chadurmukha Linga with imagery on all 4 sides that attests to their worship of Lord Shiva. The Guptas were also worshippers of Vishnu, and the imageries of Vishnu are found elaborately carved very beautifully in the Undavalli caves near Gundur, Andhra Pradesh, where a spectacular architecture of a single monolithic rock being carved out into a temple is found. This was also used by Buddhist and Jain monks as a monastery later on. With the decline of the Gupta Empire, in the Deccan, for the first time, a South Indian dynasty reached a place of prominence. They were the Chalukyas. Being Hindus, they adopted the Vedic Hinduism that had found its place in the Gupta dynasty and brought with it all its gods and its associations, and built several temples for Shiva, Vishnu, the Sabda Kanniyar, even Lajja Gauri, the fertility goddess. And the Chalukyas also adopted ideas from Gupta art and architecture. Dr. C. Sivaramamurthy, the noted archaeologist and great Sanskrit scholar, observes how the Chalukya rule could be the cusp where the north and the south get united, and there is a healthy exchange of ideas that enrich art and architecture. From the rock cut tradition, the Chalukyas move on to spectacular granite shrines like this one at the Buddhanatha temple at Badami, dedicated to Lord Shiva, as well as the Durga Devi temple at Aihole and Pattadakal. And in the field of architecture, this gave way to what is known as the Vesara style, which incorporates elements of the northern Nagara and South Dravidian styles. In the south, from the 275 CE onwards, the Pallavas, who were feudatories of the Satavahana kings, gained a foothold and set about building a huge empire, which during the 6th century AD, under the leadership of King Simhavishnu, who is also known as Avanisimha, extended all the way to Kanjipuram. King Simhavishnu built the spectacular Bhairavakona temple in Prahasam district of Andhra Pradesh, and following him came Mahendravarma Pallava I, the greatest of the Pallava kings. He switched from Jainism to Saivism, which ensured the prominence of Hindu iconography in stone. the Mandagapattu inscription in the Mandagapattu Trimurti temple in Viluppuram district, an earliest known rock-cut Krantha inscription, praises the king for his conception of rock-cut temples, the Kudaivarai Koil, made out of neither brick or timber nor mortar, a first for the Tamil country. The empty shrines in many of the 7th century cave temples built by Mahendravarma Pallava I indicate that images worshipped at that time were not made of stone. They were probably made of wood. Also, the Urchava deities taken out in the procession during temple ceremonies, scholars opine, should have also been made of wood and quite often were dressed up in regal clothes and jewellery to overcome the dullness of the wooden statues themselves. The reason behind the lack of archaeological evidence that they were made of perishable materials like limestone mortar and wood. Well, it could also be that archaeology was not taken seriously back then when Robert Foote made the discovery of the first Paleolithic stone axe in India at Athirampakam near Chengalpattu in the year 1863. All archaeologists were of the opinion that the Vaihe and Tamarabarani rivers could yield evidence of ancient civilizations. And from that time, there have been scholars who dedicated themselves to the cause. One of these scholars who took up on the exploration of Tamarabarani river areas way back in the 1860s was Bishop Robert Caldwell. Born in Ireland and educated at Glasgow, he was hardly 28 years when he came to India in the year 1838 to do his missionary work, and he chose to settle at Idayankudi village in Tirunelveli district. He fell in love with Tamil and gave us the monumental A Comparative Grammar of the Dravidian or South Indian Family of Languages, which single-handedly helped establish the independent identity of Tamil devoid of Sanskrit. And during his time, he also took up archaeological explorations in the areas around the Tamarabarani Delta, and 50 years of his research work ended in the notable work A Political and General History of the District of Tirunelveli from its earliest period to its cessation to the English government in 1801. And here Caldwell mentions how the Tamil people, even the literate ones, are more interested in philosophy and religion, are drenched in superstition and don't care much for history or for that matter archaeology. He goes on to ask the people, the educated Tamil people, to immediately engage in recording their history. How? He says, while going to the temples, inside the temple on the walls, read the inscriptions. We as foreigners are not allowed access inside and have to do with reading the inscriptions outside. With the tropical hot humid climate destroying books and palm leaf scripts day on, he talks about how huge number of books are mentioned only in name, but the texts are nowhere to be found, and says how wealthy people had palm leaf manuscripts and copper plates in their homes, which they refused to let him see. He also talks about the vandalism that the uneducated engage in destroying ancient burial sites, breaking urn burial potteries in order to steal the contents within without knowing its antiquity and archaeological value, and he even gives a case study. On the 25th of December 1872, while digging a culvert in Sri Vaikundam, the workers found a copper pot full of coins, which at that time was valued at 1 lakh rupees. Mind you, we are talking about 1872 and 100,000 rupees. He records that the laborers simply took the coins, and by the time he went to the local Dasildar and brought him back to the site, all the coins were gone and what they could retrieve was worth just 8,000 rupees. And amidst that, he found a coin marked in Arabic saying Mohammedan year 71, another coin from 1276 marked Peter of Aragon, which again went to show that this pot should have contained the coin collection of an unknown person. And much to his frustration, the local court ruled that the coins belonged to those who found them, founders, keepers. So this was the way in which history was being lost even at that time. Today, while excavations are going on and new discoveries seem to be happening all around us, with the Kidadi excavations taking back our history to 545 BCE, only now we are undertaking the geological study of the sand pits stratification in order to throw further light on the antiquity of these sites. Well, Caldwell in those days single-handedly did this in the Tamarabarani belt, about which we will see in detail later. So now coming back to Lord Shiva, when did this Lord start dancing? For those of us, the Tamil people, he is Kalagalan, whose dance began at the very beginning of the universe. But according to Sir John Marshall, he began dancing during Harappan times itself. How? We will see in the next episode. Vanakkam. சரி, எடிட்டிங்கே பண்ணக்கூடாதுன்னு நினைக்கிறேன்.